Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're delighted to welcome our friend Byrd Pittner. He's the founder and philosopher-in-chief of the Sustainable Culture Lab. And we're here to talk about his book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America. It's already received lots of notice. It's named as one of NPR's Books of the Year and is already having an impact. We'd like to thank the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights, and in particular, its director, Michael Pates, Dignity Rights Initiative of the Center for Human Rights, headed by the Honorable Bernice Donald from the Fourth Circuit, the Dignity Law Institute at Delaware Law School, and Dignity Rights International, headed by Aaron Daly, for sponsoring this conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about Barrett. Barrett's besides being a friend, he's a philosopher, a writer, and a journalist. And he's been a contributing columnist for lots of publications, including the Daily Beast, the BBC, the Guardian, the Daily Dot, and the Huffington Post. In addition to his printed work, he's also appeared on political news shows, including Hardball with Chris Matthews and Morning Joe on MSNBC, and the Diane Rehm Show on NPR. As I mentioned, we're here to talk about his book. And his book involves this query into what the meaning is and the effects of what's called ethnocide. So Barrett, again, let me welcome you on behalf of everybody. And if we could just start with that, with explaining to our audience, what is ethnocide? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Jim. So ethnocide, it's the destruction of a people's culture while keeping the people. This term was coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, who at the same time invented the word genocide. Lemkin was a Jewish immigrant to the US. He fled the Nazis during World War II. And when he was in the US, he wanted to make the American government and military aware of what was happening to his people. And he recognized that there just wasn't a word to describe the precise type of destruction that was occurring. And so he coined genocide to describe that atrocity. And at the same time, he coined the word ethnocide because Jewish people were a genos, but they're also a culture or an ethnic group, an ethnos. And so he thought the word to be interchangeable. But as we know, genocide became the word that we all know, and ethnocide kind of just existed in the footnotes of history. And so the word kind of has been largely ignored for, 60 some odd years. And in my book, I bring it back to describe the transatlantic slave trade, because that was the goal of that. The goal was to keep the bodies of African people, but to systematically destroy the culture of those people, to therefore create an oppressive, divided chattel slavery system, and then to build society around the normalization of this oppression, division, cultural destruction. And so when you have a society that has a foundational component that's not been named, then that provokes a lot of thought and a need for new language to describe the things in which we encounter on a day-to-day basis. And ethnocide kind of commences with that exploration, like the awareness of the word commences the exploration.
So, Baron, I'm wondering if, as part of that exploration, you'd be willing to read a passage that gets to this effort to try to find the language to describe something that's new and fresh, which is what you've come up with concepts like Africano and ethnocider and ethnocide and so on. So I'm wondering if you would read the passage on page 6 that begins with the word rarely, which brings into sharp focus these issues about etymology, as well as in some ways cosmology and philosophy. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll read this whole paragraph. This is from the prologue of the book. So here we go. Rarely do we confront the insufficiency of our own language. Instead, we prefer to imagine a society devoid of our systemic tyranny. And in so doing, we can attach ourselves to inaccurate, yet clearly preferable identifiers, such as democracy, freedom, and liberty. As a Black man, I have never been able to accept the status quo because my culture stems from America's systemic tyranny. American hegemony relies on the deliberate and strategic silencing of voices, including mine. And there are many methods for making one mute in America. One's voice can be forcefully silenced, or one can be bribed into embracing one's oppression. Yet once one can express their voice, their words must do more than describe the oppression and hypocrisy that befalls their community. Because America's corrupted, oppressive, and hypocritical language will work to silence their liberating discourse or turn it into meaningless gibberish. For our liberated words to have meaning in America, they must speak to the collective we that America has never wanted to exist.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic passage in the prologue, Byrd. So again, let me commend you on that, and of course the entire book. But how do you distinguish ethnocide from sort of the other facets of society that you're intimating? In America in particular, what's the daylight between ethnocide and racism, for example?
I guess to look at it, like racism is more like a branch from an ethnocidal tree. So for example, like America's notions of race largely are shaped by ethnocide. Like the idea of like the Black race, like Black isn't a place. Like no one's like, you don't look on a map and it says this is Black. You look on a map and it says Africa, but we call African people Black people because ethnocide worked to destroy the culture of those people and just make them a big color. And then we can just stigmatize this color and put racial whatever onto the color. And so when we're talking about race, like clearly ethnocide has influenced what we even think race is. Same thing for white people. White's not a place either. You don't look on a map and there's a continent called white. There's no whiteistan, And so all these white people, like they just intentionally decided to destroy their own European culture and classify themselves as a color of people because that color would distinguish them from the other color of people who are getting oppressed. And now we can be a color that gets to oppress other people. And so even our concepts of like white versus Black, that's a conversation where culture doesn't even exist in it. It's just a conversation of like competing colors and like fabricated stigmas and notions of these colors based upon the destruction of culture. So if we're talking about race in America, you aren't going to accurately be able to talk about it if you aren't aware of ethnocide. Ethnocide is the thing that precedes race. So like it's more of a derivative of an ethnocidal norm and not like a whole other section of like school of thought or whatever that has overlaps. It's just a derivative.
Okay. And then in this, this destruction of culture that you describe in your book, can you give us some examples of how ethnocide has sort of shown its ugly face throughout history and then also in America? But I thought maybe if we could start with what you just mentioned, is really what was the genesis of ethnocide?
So like, for examples, you want like current examples or past examples or go from like the past to the present?
How about that? Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. So frankly, like the genesis for ethnocide is clearly a bunch of European people just valued money over human existence. And they wanted to get a lot of money. And they said, we're cool with ruining a bunch of people's lives in pursuit of all that stuff. And so if you believe that there's this continent, there are two continents, and there's just like magic pools of gold or land that you can completely like remake to fuel like a globalized economy because you can now grow an infinite amount of cotton because, Georgia is the size of England. So imagine if you're British, you get over to the Americas and you have a bunch of land that's like 20, 40 times the size of your whole country. You'll be like, this is incredible. I can make so much money and I'll just ruin people's lives in the pursuit of that. And so if you're willing to like ruin someone's life to make money, then destroying their culture or whatever you can to, oppress them so that they can make money on your behalf will just be like a logical extension of, what makes sense to you, which is super dystopian. And so that's kind of how I would, hypothesize that it began in this iteration. A key example just for ethnocide at the very beginning, it's like chattel slavery is just like it's an implement of ethnocide. It's a group of people that are existing, like slave owners, people that support slavery, just avowed racists that were just essentially like all the white people in the South, if not America, that just arbitrarily thought that a color of people were just bad, and that the best way to like keep that color of people separate from the other color, you had to create like an idea such as like the 1 drop rule, where 1 drop of African blood is a complete erasure of your white color, and that color usurps any sort of cultural category. It's just the color. The color's gone. Once that color's gone, you're a nothing, and now you get to be oppressed forever. Like that's pretty bleak, and that's just like what they made on their own. That's just like Europeans' ideas. But if you look at how the methods of oppressing, African Black people in America, it was all cultural destruction. Let's break up families. Let's make sure that they can't speak their language. Let's make sure that they can't practice their religion. They can't, all the stuff that you would associate with the culture that these people had in Africa. Let's just make all of that illegal. Let's shatter it. Let's demonize it. Let's stigmatize it, where even if they do it on their own, they feel that there's something bad about doing their own culture, and that they need to instead live in the absence of a culture and be oppressed. Like that's at a foundational level. And clearly to this day, there's remnants of it in everything that happens in America. Like I think a key example that people relate to would be just gentrification. Like gentrification isn't bad because like white people are bad. It's not like a color thing. No one's mad that like someone that looks a particular way moves into the neighborhood, really. It's more so like when these people move into the neighborhood, what's the culture they're trying to cultivate in that neighborhood? And that culture that they're trying to cultivate is one that my presence is better because I'm bringing money. I'm not trying to be a part of the existing community that's predominantly Black, that have been that had to like make a culture because they can't live via like the exploitation of other people, don't have as much social capital in America to do that. So there's normally like some sort of culture that African Americans have made in that community. And once that culture becomes appealing and to people outside the community, lots of people are like, I'm going to move into it and not actually be a part of it. I'm just going to bring money, and that money will make it better. That money will make it harder for the people that live there to live there, and they'll move out. But that's just what happens. That's the nature of things. And now people are becoming quite disruptive, not because they have malicious intent, but just because they have an ethos that the wealth that they bring with their whiteness is more important than the culture that existed before they showed up. And that also that wealth disincentivizes them to become a part of that culture because that culture isn't as important as their money. And now we have all sorts of problems where people like, it becomes a destabilizing influence, not because people are trying to do something bad, but because they just haven't been taught how to culturally be a stabling influence in the communities in which they've chosen to live. And that's clearly like just like a manifestation of ethnocide today.
Yeah, and so in your book, you're relaying a conversation that you had with a friend about whiteness. And I won't have the language exactly, Barrett, but you said that you wouldn't wish whiteness on your worst enemy. And you're making a point about culture, about the lack of culture. And with that, it's these contrasting views of an ethos, as you mentioned, between existentialism and essentialism. And on the existentialism part, that's where culture lies, but where the essentialism part, there's kind of a death of culture, but that's where white lives. And I wonder if you could just explain that and provide some examples of how that works out. Thank you.
Yeah. So when you guys, hopefully you guys want to buy my book after this, but you'll see with Jim's questions, he's like connecting something from the beginning of the book to something at the end of the book, which is good because it clearly means you've read the whole thing and he's making all the connections. But it's fun for me as answering the questions where I'm like mentally jumping from like chapter 10 to chapter 3 and like, okay, all right. So anyways, to answer the question, like the first part about, not wishing whiteness on my worst enemy, this came up from a conversation I had with a friend of mine, and she's from Charleston, South Carolina, and my family's from Charleston, South Carolina. And in the book, I have a whole part, a lot of it is about how my family were like free persons of color in Charleston and a whole bunch of stuff. Her family were actually slave owners in Charleston, like, yikes. And so when she looks back at her past, she sees bad stuff, like the wealth, the money that allowed her, I'm sure her grandma and blah, 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 to get an education and all that kind of stuff that's helped her be a person who's fairly stable to this day. Like it came from a horrible person doing horrible things to people and that being like their livelihood. And that creates a big problem where like you just aren't sure how to be or do good because like, you came from a root that isn't good. And like, that's a really profound problem that like, I think a lot of white people have that Black people just don't. Like we're human beings. So it's not like we're just perfect people, but it's pretty understood that a lot of the things that prevent us from being as good as we would like to be aren't due to us not trying as hard as we want. It's due to like impediments from America as a whole that were created by white people that prevent us to get to where we should, equitably. And so, that's like a really clear dynamic. And like, the funny thing is, say if I got into a time machine, if a Black person got into a time machine and got some ancestor from the 1800s and brought them to the present, there's a really good chance that that person's going to be perfectly okay. They'll just be astonished at like all the stuff they have, but like their worldview and how they react to people won't be that problematic. They'll just be surprised that white people are like nicer. That'd probably be the extent of it. The white person gets into a time machine and they bring their ancestor to the present, and there's going to be all sorts of issues. Like that person is not going to he probably would be outraged that Barack Obama was president. He'd think it'd be like the end of the world, stuff like that, where why would you wish that on somebody where if they look into the past and see who taught them how to be a good person, they kind of have to cherry pick to get something. That's not fun. And so that's the first part. The second part is this key existentialist idea that Jean-Paul Sartre came about, where a key component of existentialism is the phrase existence precedes essence. And this is significant because prior to that, much of European thought is what we would call essentialist, where essence was the most important thing. And this derives from René Descartes and his phrase, I think, therefore I am, where I think, therefore I am is saying that your thoughts prove your existence. Therefore, your thoughts are more important than existence. Without those thoughts, then you don't exist. And those thoughts, those ideas, philosophically, they describe those as one's essence. And having an essence isn't bad, but if you think it's more important than existence, you now have a philosophy that justifies doing any sort of destructive thing if it is in pursuit of some sort of idea that you have. And so if you have an idea that white people are the best and African people are animals, that idea, that makes sense to do whatever you want to justify that, even if it just destroys existence. Makes perfect sense because essence precedes existence. And for Europeans around, early to mid 20th century, they had an up close and personal realization of how problematic that was because of World War I and World War II, where Germans would just say, our essence is better than the essence of these people or those people, so let's just go kill a whole bunch of them and turn the whole continent into a nightmare. Well, when your ideas are basically resulting in you nearly wiping yourself off the planet and destroying your own existence, there's going to be an emphasis on trying to come up with better ideas because, people don't want to have a collective mass death. And that's kind of where this came into being. And so, the notion of existence preceding essence is the roots of existentialism. And you can see how this philosophy of European essence usurping existence has been a key component of colonization and the shaping of America, and a lot of just how the world is ordered now. And it's just a really bad idea. And it's hard to articulate why an idea is bad if you don't have the language to articulate what a good idea is. And so, making more and more Americans aware of existence preceding essence is important, but it's also really, really important to acknowledge that like white is just an essence. Like it's not actually an existence that attached to a place or people surviving collectively. It's just an idea that Europeans have that they think is more important than the existence of everything that happened in the Americas. And so now we have this weird society that's built around like people holding on to the essence or idea of whiteness to the detriment of countless many other things in society. And so that America is all about the idea, the dream, not about the existence. People here will gladly have like a horrible existence if that bad existence lets them keep the idea that it's a dream, which can't get more dystopian than that.
Well, we're trying, right? Yeah, but about this idea of the contrast between essence and existence, I think is so interesting, and it helps understand outcomes or explain outcomes. In your book, you also write about Nietzsche's writings and the Übermensch. This idea that it's connected to essence, or American exceptionalism is another example connected to essence, or Make America Great Again. I'm not just picking on America, because you also write in your book about other attempts to destroy culture, ethnocide in other ways, like arguably what's happening with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. You write about, your book sort of portends that event. So what is your thought about how essence and existence are demonstrated, in 2022, A, and B, what can be done about that division?
Well, it's demonstrated everywhere. like America is built around essence, and we don't. It's like, so first of all, it's fascinating where if you think about ethnocide being a foundational component of the society, which it is, and we've just lived without that word for pretty much the entirety of this society. I think, essentially prior to my book existing, it wasn't even an idea that was in almost anyone's heads in relation to the United States. So if you don't have like a foundational word to describe your own society, you're probably lacking a whole bunch of other words to accurately describe your society. And so like essence, I think, is one of those. And so if you just think about it, like whiteness is an essence. Black is also an essence. Like that's it. People that immigrate to America, they come here with a culture that's not an essence. Like it's an identity that's attached to the physical place in which they live and have their family has lived for generations. And when they move to America, America tries to categorize them according to the arbitrary essences that we have created, where like Asian people act like this, but like Asia's gigantic. It's way bigger than Europe and has so many more people. And America thinks it makes sense that all these people fit within an idea, that idea could be the model minority. Ridiculous, just totally ridiculous. But like we think about that because we don't have a concern for their culture. We just have a concern for the idea of what billions of people all simultaneously do and act based on nothing, just absolutely nothing. And so, that's one example. The list can go on. I will say a big thing in the book, when I'm talking about essence and Sartre and this idea of bad faith, is like the example that Sartre gave in Being a Nothingness for Bad Faith, that was really revolutionary in Europe. Like it just goes over American heads half the time, which was the example of a waiter, where he saw a waiter in a restaurant, and this waiter was a bit too precise, a bit too exact in all of his movements. And this really annoyed Sartre, because this person didn't seem to be acting like a person who had agreed to work at a restaurant for X number of hours a day for money, and he would be a waiter for that time. He was a person acting as if his whole identity, who he was, his existence, was that of a waiter. And he was like, this is bad faith. This person is lying to themselves and engaging in the world in an untruthful way because they're delusional, because their identity, their existence, isn't their job. They're a person who has an existence and then who has agreed to have a job to get money in exchange. When you say this to Americans, they just like, it blows their mind, because we've been taught since we were babies that our whole purpose, our existence, who we are, is going to be defined in our profession. And that's what we're building our life around. If we get fired from a job and we can't have that profession anymore, it's like, who am I? Like, these are just basic things that Americans believe make sense. And it's absolutely crazy, but we believe it because it's all about an idea. It's all about the essence. I'm the essence where, like, I believe my identity as a lawyer or my identity as a basketball player is the most important thing in my entire life, where it is my life. And if someone is not telling me I am that, then what even am I? Like, that's nuts. You were a whole bunch of things before you got that degree. Like, it doesn't, like, it's crazy. But like, there's just so many countless manifestations that, like, you know, I could talk for days about it. It's just, once you kind of get the language to articulate stuff that you've always seen, then you can just start seeing it everywhere.
So yeah, an ethnocide and the concept of ethnocide is a beginning. It's not an end. The dictionary of ethnocide hasn't been written yet. So maybe that'll be your third book, Byrd.
I have a newsletter where I give people a new word every week. So I write it in weekly installments.
Okay. Well, let me just follow up on one thing that you mentioned about bad faith and good faith. You know, you were sort of channeling Sartre when you wrote, I'm just quoting you here, if that's okay, but bad faith has become good faith. They believe in the goodness of bad faith. So could you give some examples of how bad faith has become good faith and how people have been deluded into believing that in the goodness of bad faith?
Yeah. So here I articulate it like a theoretical way, and then I'll just articulate how it manifests in the world.
Sure.
So if I'm a person who's going to, you know, implement ethnocide, the person or people that I'm talking to, if they know my agenda, they're never going to talk to me. Like, why would anyone interact with me if they know my goal is to destroy their culture for my benefit and then exploit them in perpetuity? Like, why would anyone interact with me if that's what I'm going to do? So I have to engage with them in bad faith. I have to deceive them. Now, the question is, will that deception be that I'm knowingly deceiving them? Or will the deception be that I've deceived myself into believing that me exploiting them for my benefit is beneficial to them? Like, those are like the mental loops I'm going to have to go through if I'm going to implement ethnocide. And you can see how America manifests this problem all the time. So, you know, if we, like, for example, I remember a couple years ago, I had some casual conversation with a friend of mine, and this friend mentioned Thomas Jefferson. And I was like, he's not a good guy. And this person got real mad at me. And I was like, I think this is so funny. Like, I'm Black. Like, why would I need to think Thomas Jefferson, who owned like hundreds of Black people, is a good person? Like, just the expectation that I would think he's good is just outrageous, you know? And so I tell my friend, no, like, he's a bad guy. Everybody that's alive today should be better than Thomas Jefferson. Like, if we have people on, like, in America right now that are like as good as Thomas Jefferson was, we're living in a really bad place. Facts. And then she got all upset. And so I then said, all right, here, let's think about this. We're friends, and you think and we're friends because I'm a good writer and I'm funny and I'm smart and have good ideas, whatever these things are. And she's like, yeah, sure. But what if you found out I had like 10 people imprisoned in my basement? Like, if I had 10 people imprisoned in my basement, would you think I'm still a good person? And the response is, well, that's not fair. I was like, how is it not? I was like, yeah, it's not fair. Like, he had 100 people. I'm only saying 10. So like, what would you think? Would it make sense for you to go to a dinner party and people are talking about how Barrett has 10 people in prison in his basement, and your rebuttal is, let's just not talk about that. Let's talk about like how funny he was, how well, like his writing was so good, the wit, let's talk about that. His enjoyment of architecture and the arts and theater. Let's talk about all of that stuff and just completely disregard all the people that are in the basement. Can we just be civil and do that? like it's crazy. But like, this is the conversation that Americans expect everybody to have. Like George Washington had a mouth filled with the teeth of his enslaved people. And we're like, oh, look at those pearly whites. He never told a lie. It's like, get out of here. And so like, there's just like a certain level of bad faith that America just demands everybody to have in order to have a civil conversation, where they expect Black people to revere people that didn't think Black people were even human beings and whose entire livelihood was based around enslaving hundreds of Black people for their entire life. Where like, to the extent where they didn't even need to have jobs and they could just live in debt forever, because they always had, capital, human capital that, they can at least pay the interest on their loans. And, when they're dead, someone else can go and buy all these people. And, that's how they'll pay off all the stuff they own. They could die in mountains of debt. So like, that's just an example, like a foundational example of just bad faith that we have at every facet of our society. And, like, that doesn't mean that a person didn't always come up with hasn't come up with one good idea. Sure. But like, Jim's a teacher, I'm a teacher. There's plenty of students who will give me a paper, and that paper will have like 3 good ideas in it. And at the end of the day, it deserves a D, It's like, that's the grade. They aren't good at this. That doesn't mean that 100% of what they did is bad, but it does mean that at the end of the day, that grade is a D. And I'm not going to delude myself in believing that they get an A, because I just don't want to admit that they deserve a D. So like, that's an example of like essence over existence, where the idea trumps existence. The idea trumps what people are doing. This idea then encourages people to engage in bad faith all the time, where you expect Black people to revere people who didn't think Black people were people. Like, I don't know how that's just gross, but that's just like a weird norm we have in our society, because we're accustomed to engaging in bad faith in almost everything that we do, because the people that made the society made it by engaging in bad faith. Like America even has a phrase, Indian givers, where like the Indians were the ones that backtracked on the deals. Like, we know that's not even real. So sorry, I could talk forever on that, but I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, and so let me ask you then about something that is even a bit more personal. You write in your book about your ancestors and how they arrived in America, and you even tracked down the bill of sale for some of your ancestors. So I'm curious if you could just share with our audience how you did that. That's first, and secondly, about this dichotomy, or really delusion, I should say, delusional dichotomy. Did I just come up with a phrase?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, between good and bad, and what makes a person good, and so on. You also found, I'm calling them diaries, but that's not right, but entries from slave owners who owned people who are related to you, who wrote about how they would read the Bible and they would read philosophy and they would practice Greek, and then they would go humiliate and harm somebody else. But then get back to their Bible and incorporate it into their essence. So I wouldn't mind if you talked about those two things.
Yeah. So to go with the first part, the bill of sale, it's a funny story, I guess. Not funny, humorous, but just like interesting. My dad's family is from Prattville, Alabama. And so the story I've always been told is that we were some of the first enslaved people to be brought to Prattville, Alabama by Daniel Pratt, who made the town. Daniel Pratt was a New Englander who went down to like Savannah to just like look for opportunity or whatever. And eventually he then moved from Savannah to Autauga County in Alabama and made a big factory. And that factory produced cotton gins. And he's to this day regarded as Alabama's first and greatest industrialist. And so my dad's family is from Prattville. We were like some of the first Black people that Daniel Pratt brought to Prattville. And so my dad's family has always kind of had like a connection to the city, and that like we kind of made it. Now, the thing that's interesting once we like dug a little bit deeper is we're pretty confident that my ancestor, Charles Atwood, was Daniel Pratt's illegitimate son. And the reason for that is like Daniel Pratt owned like hundreds of Black people, but we have the bill of sale for that ancestor that Daniel Pratt bought, but we also have the bill of sale when Daniel Pratt went back to Savannah and bought my ancestor a wife. So if there's like a Black person that you have enslaved and they're just like working in the fields, you're not going to go from Alabama to Savannah to get that person a wife. You know, that's just like not a thing. You're not going to go spend money to do that. But this Daniel Pratt did. And then then when Reconstruction happened, my ancestor got like a job in the factory, and Daniel Pratt gave him like stock in the railroad. So we're pretty sure that this really light-skinned Black person, because we have photos of him, was like the son of Daniel Pratt. And so that's why we have the bill of sale. My dad just went to Alabama when I was a kid and just like heard that they were on sale at some place and went and bought them. So we just had them in our house for decades. It's just like a normal thing, which it's interesting because it's normal for me and it's just shocking for everybody else. We have them. And so that's the Alabama side. And so I tell that story about this connection because it just shows just the dystopian kind of vulgar foundation of just like basic Southern society, where like, just look at it, like this person, Charles, we suspect is the son of Alabama's greatest industrialist. And this person can't just like live a life. He just can't be a person where he can go and find someone and marry her and do all this other stuff. His dad literally has to go to Savannah and buy a woman and take her back to Alabama and say, this person is your wife, because you can't marry a white lady. You can't do that. She'd have a drop of Black and now she's done forever. Your kids are done forever. So you just get to live like this. I'll buy you a wife and you get to work in the factory. But it's not like we're rich because we have like the stock from the railroad. If we are white people, and there are white descendants of Daniel Pratt who have a lot of money in Alabama because he gave them a bunch of stuff. He's their greatest industrialist. So, you know, that's something that to be aware of. I guess that the next part, what was the second part of the question?
The second part was about the entries that you shared.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which just struck me as just being really remarkable and predictable at the same time, I suppose.
Yeah, it's remarkable in how it just brazen it is. So this gentleman named I don't know if he's a gentleman, but he's the founder of Richmond, Virginia. His name is William Byrd, and my uncle did a lot of DNA ancestry stuff, and he believes we're distant relatives of the Byrds that colonized the Virginias and the Carolinas. And so William Byrd was like one of the early ones, and his family created Richmond, Virginia. And so this William Byrd fellow, when he was alive, he kept a diary, and that diary was published like 100, maybe 200 years after he passed away. And in this diary, he just wrote about his regular day, just what he did on a daily basis. And it was like, I woke up in the morning, I read a little bit of Greek, read a little bit of Latin, had a nice breakfast. Then I beat my slave. They were lazy. I then I went to town, had lunch with a friend. It was great. Came back home, had to beat another slave. Then hung out with my friend. I hit on his wife. That got me in trouble. My wife was mad at me. But I went home and I said my prayers and God forgave me. And then I just did it again, like every single day. And so, and it's just like in his diary. This is just, you can go online and just look it up. It's like William Byrd of Westover Diary. And you can just like put in any date and just get the entries. And it's just like this. It's not even hidden. And so there's one passage where there's like a young Black boy that has peed the bed because, you know, wetting the bed is an indication of trauma. And he was traumatized, rightfully so. He was enslaved by this rich guy that colonized and created the dividing lines for the Carolinas. And if you go to Richmond, Virginia to this day, like so many streets are named after William Byrd because he made the city. And so this boy wet the bed. And so William Byrd just beat him up for wetting the bed. And then another slave tried to conceal it. And so then he beat her because she tried to hide it. And so after these two slaves got beatings, surprise, surprise, a couple of days later, the kid wet the bed again. And it was like, these beatings didn't fix it. So I got to go more extreme. And so then he got a jar of, he filled a pint with urine. And he made this little boy drink it as punishment so that he would learn not to wet the bed. And he just wrote this, like, this is what I did. This made sense. And these lazy Black people just won't learn their lesson. So I just got to like beat this boy and make him drink urine on a daily basis until he learns not to wet the bed. And like, he just wrote it. Like, this is not anything he thinks is out of the ordinary or bad. This is just the proper way things need to do because I have an idea that these people are savages and therefore everything I do is a good idea because I believe it. And since their existence doesn't matter, I don't really care how it responds to them. I believe this will work because I believe it will work. And there's nothing they can do or say that will make me believe otherwise because my essence is more important than their existence. So I'll just do this forever. And like, that's just how things work. And that's, you know, and the Byrd family up until like the early 20th century was arguably the most important family in all of Virginia. Like, they were staunch segregationists. They were, you know, it was called the Byrd political machine, where they just ran the whole state. And so this guy, William, who has, you know, his family has a whole legacy in the state, and he's documented just for years, just how he would torture Black people in his diary, just wrote in his diary, like, dear diary, made people will drink urine today. Then I prayed and God forgave me. And I slept really well last night, you know, like that. And that's, he just wrote about that. You can read the book, you can buy it. It's, the whole thing's digitized. It's, you know, so I think
the tone there, it struck me as being astonishing. Like you said, it was just sort of like, you know, he's writing in his diary about the events of the day, and it didn't occur to him even to reflect upon or to second guess a decision to put on paper how he was treating other human beings.
There's nothing, there's no notion of anything tragic where he did anything wrong. Like, even when he like tries to hit on somebody else's wife and his wife gets upset, he's more upset that he got caught and that he's getting punished, you know, because he reads the Bible and prays and he believes that he gets forgiven at the end of the day. So like, it all worked out, you know, like, I didn't do anything wrong because they forgave me for the wrong things that I did. Now I'm all good. I'll start the day fresh and, you know, I'll try to be better. And if I'm not better, and by better, that's mostly for the stuff pertaining to like cheating on his wife. For the stuff pertaining to all the slaves, he has no aspirations to get better. He's pretty confident that he's doing all the right stuff.
Okay.
And it's like, you know, like if you were in Virginia and you had a time machine, you could go back and bring William Byrd from that time to the present, he'd be like one of the worst people ever. That's like the dynamic that like white people have. If I if I got one of these enslaved people that he was terrorizing and brought them to the present, like the biggest issue would just be like having them to like giving them the resources to overcome their trauma. And then they'd probably be like pretty good people. And they rightfully so would be like a bit skittish about interacting with white people. But once they find some white person that's not like forcing them to drink urine or beating them on a daily basis or doing other forms of torture, I bet they would probably acclimate to the realization that not all of them are like, psychopaths, like,
Well,
and
you're right that it's a product of this narrative, this delusional narrative, and you're in your book, and again, I'm just interpreting, Barrett. I'm putting words into your mouth, but you can say them much better than I can. But that with whiteness, there's this essence, and that the essence isn't a culture, like you say.
yeah,
But Black people have culture,
right.
and
So
Black people have existence. So there's like a hole in the soul that you talk about Geist and Geistmore. There's a
yeah,
hole in the soul of white people that is filled by culture and existence with Black people.
yeah. So this is, I'm glad you're talking about this, because it's funny. This is the part that I had to like move up earlier in the book, because I just had to be more specific, because like the white people that were like editing and reading it, just like something's missing here. I don't get it. I was like, all right, so this part that I was going to have is like chapter 8 needs to be chapter 2 now, because the question is like, what's culture? We're like in America, because we don't have it. Culture is something that you get to have when you have like a lot of money. Like if you have a lot of money, then you get to be cultured because you get to buy stuff and you get to go to the theater. You can afford tickets to the Met or whatever it is. You get to purchase all of it. But prior to that, you just are like a poor person that doesn't have access to culture. So culture is a thing that like you need access to via money, which makes sense if you're trying to build a society where money is more important than human life. So in the book, I had to define like what is culture, which is like a very strange thing that you have to define because it's really obvious when you think about it, but we're not taught to think about it here. But culture is just the outcome of a collection of people living in a specific place, trying to make the stuff they need to survive. Like that's it. Like the culture of a people in a cold climate is gonna be different than the culture of a people in a warm climate. Not because like one's better or worse than the other, but because you need different stuff to live in those places. So your houses will be different, your clothes will be different, your food will be different, your daily routines will be different, the words you create will be different, the art you create will be different, the stuff that you do to make the things you need to survive joyful, make them like art, turn it into art, all of that will be different because of the physical place in which you live and due to everybody trying to like survive together. That's why like the language will be shared. The clothes will be similar amongst all the people. That's culture. Like we don't think of it like that because our society was never built to exist like that. It was like perpetually divided, and culture was something that that was destroyed from one people and another group of people got to have it. But like if you are destroying it in order to survive, what culture is will become a different thing. It actually won't be culture. It'll be like a facade of culture that you need money to have.
Yeah, and if I could follow up on that, Barrett, like, so in whiteness, it's sort of baked in, this idea of equating culture with wealth and
Yeah,
liberty. And you write about this, that, this idea of freedom, for example, in the United States is linked to ownership and control and property and wealth, and that's whiteness.
yeah,
And that's not, to kind of paraphrase Frederick Douglass, that's not liberty for Black people.
right.
What is Independence Day to a Black person? So what are your thoughts about, again, so as I'm reading your book, I'm also thinking, as I read your book, thinking, what to do about that.
Yeah, so like there's a lot of things you can do about it, but to go like with the Frederick Douglass example and like why Black people have culture, we're like, if we live in a society, which we do, where we're not encouraged to live via the exploitation of other people. And that's not me saying that I think all white people do that. I'm just saying that the structure of the society is one that encourages white people to be able to live in this way if they so choose. You know, like there's an incentive to do that. And so, but for Black people, that incentive doesn't exist. And so we have to survive by making our own culture in this place. And so that's why, you know, like the cuisine in like the South will be distinct, like, you know, Black food or Creole food in New Orleans will be like the culture of the place. And then white people will get access to it. And then like, oh, let's make it into a business. Let's put all this in cans and send it around the world. How good could this culture be if we put it in a factory and then we monetized it? And would you be happy, Black person, if I put your face on the can? Because then like, you know, like all this stuff happens where like it's an industrialized erosion of culture that was created. You know, the culture was created by the Black people. And then the way to like live with that culture is by destroying it in the name of monetization. And so as a Black person, we make that culture because we have to live collectively in a specific place and survive. So it'll define the words, it'll define our food, it'll define our clothes, it'll define all that stuff. And at a certain moment, that culture will become a threat. And that threat will either get like destroyed, a la like Tulsa, Oklahoma, you know, or that threat could be that the Black kid says, I also want to swim at the public swimming pool with a bunch of white people. That's another threat. Or that threat will be, oh man, I think these Black people can make a lot of money off of this. How can I take this stuff and I make a lot of money off of it instead? Because I have the business acumen. I have the access to all this stuff, you know? And so then it becomes decultured in the name of money. And so like, that's just how America thinks things should work. And it's just horrible ideas that clearly derive from ethnocide. And so the way, like the question is like, how do you fix it? And I'll say, this is like one of the first questions people started asking me when I told them about ethnocide, because for me, ethnocide was a pretty liberating word because it helped me articulate how I had always seen the world, but never knew how to say. For other people, it really made them realize that the world that they thought was great, which I never thought was great, is not good. Now the question is like, so what is good? How do I do good? I've been thinking I was doing good stuff this whole time, and it's like not as good as I thought because you just pointed it out. There's a foundational flaw. And so the question is, A, to do good things, you have to be able to articulate what bad is. And so like this book helps with that. But once you recognize there's like a linguistic void, you then have to start cultivating new language and new ideas for the good you're trying to make. And so near the end of the book, I started doing that so people can start having that language. And so a key example in the book is just like what good means in America. And for the most part, good, we define it as like having good intent, which that's just irrelevant. You know, like, because how can you know what someone's intent is? Like judging people based on their intent, you can't get more bad faith than that. Where like somebody can actually do something bad and they can feel justified in doing that bad thing by either like knowingly engaging in bad faith and telling someone that their intent was good, like, because we don't know what their intent is, or they could just be delusional and be fully confident that their bad idea is actually something that has good intent, that is good. And that means that like we can't stop them from doing it because it's based on their intent. And some, you know, America has this weird notion of like inherent goodness where like people are just like naturally good. So if someone has good intent, you know, let's just believe that the second time they do it, it'll work out because they have good intent and they're good people. It's ridiculous. So like what you need to do is have a notion of good that's actually based on existence and not based on essence. And so how I articulate that, a simple analogy would be having a good friend. Like a good friend is not good because of like the ideas that are good, such as like having money or being funny or whatever, being attractive, that doesn't make a good friend. A person that's a good friend is someone that if you have to think about the future, you imagine them being there with you in like a nurturing, sustainable way. Like if you need someone to pick you up from the airport, if you imagine that person, they're a good friend. They're good because they help sustain you and nurture you in your existence. That's a goodness based on existence and not their intent. Lots of people have plenty of friends who want to do good things, but are a bad influence. That's a bad friend. So you have to start having conversations about good, and this can be for yourself and at a micro and macro level, where good is based on existence and not just like ideas or essence.
So if we could just expand that lens a little bit to American democracy, which so many people think of as I do or did too, as a good overall, as a categorical good, that societies that are buoyed and imbued by democracy tend to, this is word makeuping, but gooder, using your language, than societies without it. But you point out that hasn't worked for Black people. And, with echoes, James Baldwin, The Fire next time, that this just flat out doesn't work. And I'm wondering if you would read another passage to us, Barrett. It's on page 240, and it's the paragraph that begins with the Americans.
Okay, and 240.
The 240.
Americans. And let me get to it. Here we go. All right. Okay, this paragraph. Here we go. The Americans who use democracy as a substitute for culture believe in a governmental system that both exists without the culture that created it and is also the culture that creates and sustains itself. Governments, and especially democracies, exist to serve the people of a society, but America has never had a united people or culture. America's ethnocidal society created perpetual division, and ethnociders created and ethnociders, who are the people who create and perpetuate ethnocide, created a democratic system based on serving themselves and exploiting the ethnocidee. By embracing America's democracy as if it were one's culture, Americans embrace exploitation when they believe they are championing equality.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Yeah, so Barrett, we're going to get to questions here next after this, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. If you could explain the role of the kind of congruence of ethnocide and democracy. Like progressives, I'll just pick on progressives for a moment, kind of view existence as democracy. Mm-hmm. And you say that's not a good, that's not a societal good, that's not good for Black Americans. But again, I'm putting words into your mouth, but I'm wondering if you would explain how it is that democracy can be delusional and actually feed ethnocide.
Yeah, 100%. Well, like our democracy was built by people who were engaging in ethnocide and sustained division. And they tried to create a democracy that was based on excluding people and saying certain people just weren't human beings, therefore they can't be a part of it. So at a foundational level, the goal of our democracy was not to serve society. It was to serve a group of people in society and exploit other people. Just if you look at the Electoral College and the 3/5 compromise, all of that was based on giving slave owners a disproportionate say in the shaping of American democracy. Like Virginia and Pennsylvania, around the founding of the country, had about the same amount of eligible white male voters. But Virginia had far more representatives in Congress than Pennsylvania did, because Virginia enslaved more people. So then if you look at who were the first presidents of the country, the majority of them came from Virginia. And we still have, the Electoral College and all of these structures that were based around ensuring that people who deprive freedom from other people had a greater say in the shaping of our democracy than the people who hadn't built a society based on enslavement. So at that level, it's just pretty obvious that American democracy was more so a facade of democracy to gloss over like systemic tyranny. It's just pretty simple. Like it's like the numbers show it. There's no ambiguity about that. And so if we as Americans today look at our democratic system as something that's going to inherently be good and solve inequalities, it's like, how does that make any sense? Like it was built to normalize inequality and to give the people who made those inequalities the greater influence. It's just an absurd thought. Another component of it, and as an African American, I find this so like bewildering, is that it's like the progressive movements that really changed our democracy in a radical way were created by Black people. Like Reconstruction is what made America good. Like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are what gave us the roadmap for America looking like it is today. The civil rights movement in the 1960s were Black people making sure that they could get the rights that they had already earned in Reconstruction. And like, white people talk about, the abolitionist movement and how like they were really all about abolishing slavery. I'll tell you one thing, I bet those enslaved people had a greater commitment to abolishing slavery than these white people. Like, before they even were allowed to be educated in the South to know that the word abolition existed in the world, I bet they're pretty pro-abolition. So like just the notion that like these progressive ideals just organically come out of like American democracy with like whiteness at the forefront, like there's just no history that backs that up. Like the power that white people have might be able to provide a greater voice to the Black people who have been intentionally made voiceless in our society, but that just because they have the power doesn't mean that they can't put the ideas first. Clearly, enslaved people were pro-abolition before the abolitionist movement. Like that's pretty obvious, And in the civil rights era, that was Black people saying, we got all this stuff in Reconstruction, give it back to us. Jim Crow took it all away, give it back. And now we talk about, the civil rights era as if those eras had like radically different ideas than the ideas of the 1860s. I'm not saying that the movement wasn't really impactful. Like it was very, very significant. We need to get those rights back. But there's no track record that American democracy will just inherently have like a moral arc towards the good. And that and at the end of the day, it's just an idea of how to organize a society for the betterment of everybody in it. But if you allow people that don't have a concern for the betterment of everybody and actually want to like oppress people, then they're going to make a democracy that's just going to be a sham, and it's not going to be a democracy. And I think as progressives view democracy as existence and not as the essence, then they become very prone to embracing oppressive structures and believing that they're liberating structures. And that's a big problem because there's a whole bunch of other people who really don't want to have progressive, equitable structures at all. And they have a wealth of documentation saying that that's good for society because that's how America was built.
Yeah, and the song that like white people sing to themselves is that democracy, it equates democracy with culture, as you point out in your book.
Right.
And then that's sort of that's
just an idea.
It's a fundamental
clearly,
concept.
Clearly, if you and I are gathering in living in a specific place and we're making all sorts of stuff, like we're making our food, we're making our music, we're making all the stuff that we have to live, at some point, we're going to come up with an idea about how to best govern that society. That idea could be good, It could also be awful. But when that idea falls apart, there's a culture that then allows people to make another idea. Like France is a great example. We talk about France as being like some democratic place, and they have a democracy right now. There's no ambiguity about that. But the process of France having this democracy right now was that they had multiple governments that all failed. And when those governments failed, they were still French. They were still culturally French. And they said, all right, cool. We still have all the cultural stuff. Let's just come together as a people again and come up with another idea and see if that one works. And then they tried another one, and it failed. Americans act like if this idea of democracy in this specific iteration doesn't succeed, then our entire existence is negated. And that's because when you don't have a culture, or you put essence before existence, when the idea is gone, you don't know how to live. And as a Black person, we've known how to live without democracy for the whole time. So like, I don't have that trauma. That's just not a thing that exists for me.
You say the same thing about money too, that,
Yeah,
hard to imagine a white person without money.
I still remember when I was a kid, I saw that it was like, this is the 80s. I look on the news and like the amount of like white bankers in New York that were jumping out of windows because they went broke. I was like, this is astonishing. I was like, these people, like this dude is killing himself because he like doesn't have money. And like, like I was middle class. So I guess we had money, but like we weren't as rich as the white people around us. But like, we've lived forever without money. And this dude is jumping out of a penthouse window because he's like, I made a bad trade on the market and I might lose my job and my country club membership will go away. Bye, wife and kids, out the window. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was like, this is crazy. This is like a logical decision to this person.
Yeah. Well, Byrd, I'm not a part of a country club, but I might.
Not saying all white people are.
No. I mean, I might lose my job here as moderator if I don't get to questions. So
yes, go ahead.
We have questions in the chat box. Thank you, everyone, for these great questions already. Please feel free to post additional ones, again, in the chat box. So the first one is about what's happening in the Ukraine. And again, I was struck by, as I was reading your book, the events of the day. Reading in your book, you talk about the Timoshenko and
Yanukovych.
And Russian ethnocide in the Ukraine and the pushback on that and so on and so forth. So I won't repeat it, but here's the question. Regarding the role of ethnocide in the Russian aggression against Ukraine, is what the question is about. As a Russian American who grew up in Russia, I found language in Mr. Pittner's book, which I bought just a few weeks before the invasion, was directly relevant to our conversations in Russian and Ukrainian communities about Russia's denial of Ukraine's cultural existence. Probably the most telling example was of a common question that ordinary Russians ask each other when talking about Ukraine. If Kyiv is the mother of the Russian cities, then how come Ukrainians live in Kyiv? So what are your thoughts about how this idea of ethnocide plays out elsewhere, including like today, what's happening right now in Ukraine?
Yeah, so ethnocide, it happens in many forms all over the world. This book focuses specifically on the U.S. because I clearly have the greatest familiarity with the place in which I live. But I will say, it feels weird to have like a joyous tone. But chapter 8 in my book is basically dedicated to the history of Ukraine and Russia, and I added this chapter almost as like, it's not a joke, but it was something to like laugh about, because I learned about this Russian/Ukrainian word, poshlost, which I believe that's the noun and the adjective is like poshly. And so this word, when I learned this word, it reminded me of Donald Trump. And I thought it was hilarious that as Trump was like cozying up to the Russians, they had a word that described the singular specific vulgarity of this person, and America just didn't. And so as we're talking about like a culture that is like lacking in the language to describe itself, the fact that we didn't have the word to describe the president was just hilarious to me. And so I added this word, and poshlos basically means like the falsely beautiful, the falsely intelligent, the falsely regal. You know, there's a vulgarity to it and it's like banal. It's just like there's three kind of tiers to this word that I've learned. And like the first tier would be like, say you're in a like a nightclub, and like there's a guy or a girl that's scantily clad and drinking too much and just being kind of vulgar. You're like, ugh, that person. Like that's the most common usage of this word poshly or poshlost. And my pronunciation's off because I just don't have the tone of Ukrainians and Russians. But then there's the second iteration, which is like a mobster, where this person walks around as, you know, they look like they're sophisticated and whatever, but then, you know, they get raided by the cops and you find out that like a lot of their money came from like selling drugs and doing stuff that was harmful to the community, and it's like corrupt. And on top of that, like their aesthetic is just like really gaudy and like gross, where it's like they got all this money and they spent it on this junk. Like what a vulgar creep, you know? And so then the most rare iteration of this is someone that's like a head of state. Clearly that doesn't happen that often. There's far more mobsters and far more like vulgar people in clubs than there are vulgar heads of state. But Ukraine had this former president named Viktor Yanukovych, who his whole agenda was to cozy up to Russia. And, you know, there were 2 nationwide revolutions against him in about a decade. So he is not a very popular person in Ukraine. And when they ousted him in 2014, he had to flee the country. He went through Crimea into Russia, and he has been living like in seclusion in Russia within like Putin's cabal of oligarchs since 2014. But once he left, the Russian tanks went into Crimea, and they also went into the eastern part of Ukraine. That's like the Donbass region, which is the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast regions. And so this whole tension that we're seeing today started when Yanukovych started really clearly when Yanukovych fled, because Putin's plan was for Yanukovych to basically just be like a puppet of Russia. And that would make Ukraine essentially like an extension of Russia while being its own country, kind of like how Belarus is an extension of Russia right now. And when that fell apart, then he's like, I might have to do militaristic stuff to do this. And so I thought this was fascinating because this was an example of a poshly head of state. And a lot of the people that like the connections between his demeanor and behavior regarding Putin and just his demeanor regarding everything and Trump's are just like eerie. It's just like so similar to the extent that Paul Manafort used to work for Yanukovych before he worked for Donald Trump. And I was like, I got this word that is really great for laughing at Donald Trump. And we also get this great example of, you know, culture and the dichotomy between Ukraine and Russia. And now this conflict happens. And now I'm kind of like an expert in the area. And I go on TV talking about Ukraine all the time, which is phenomenal.
And Byrd, and also like you write about is that these are both demonstrations or manifestations of ethnocide, you know, that like Putin and Yanukovych in your book, you know, Trump are ethnociders. And so they see the world that way. You know, Paul Manafort made $30 million, went to prison, then was pardoned. That's another extension of.
He spent his money on this gaudy junk, like ostrich leather jackets, and like, you know,
again, this idea of essence, and that, you know, that somehow there's complacency, or the word you use is sold in wealth and possession and control of other people. Hey, let me ask you.
So Yanukovych also, 1 second, let me just use real quick. So because to fully answer the question, then we'll go to the next question. I'll be quick. Sure. So the Yanukovych also had this big mansion called like Mezrina, that when he fled the country, all the Ukrainians went and like stormed it, and they just saw all this gaudy junk. And it became like a museum to just like look at the vulgarity of this guy. It's not a museum to go, oh, this is the regal nature of our former president. It's like, this is a vulgar dude, and this is how he lives. And like his aesthetic isn't different than Donald Trump's. And so a key thing about this vulgar relationship with the people is that Ukraine and Russia have always had like this weird tension where Ukraine it's warmer, it's more fertile, it's like known as the breadbasket of Europe. Like people get to wear, like swimsuits and stuff like that. While in Russia, you're just wearing a coat all the time, And so Russians have this narrative that like Ukraine just is part of them. They need it. And Ukraine, due to the physical environment of the place, creates its own culture that's distinct from Russia. And that's their culture that they're fighting for, because the place, the geography, the weather is so different that even though there's similarities, they are like distinctly different people. And that's the cultural tension, where Russians have an idea that Russia is all the places that they say is Russia, and it's like some monolithic Russia. And Putin's pushing that. I can't say that the Russian citizenry agree with that, but that's what Putin pushes. And like states in Russia aren't called states, they're called subjects. Like you are a subject. Like if America used the same language, we'd have 50 subjects instead of 50 states. And so even that speaks to like the normalization of like subjugation to the czar or to the president. And that's, quite different than how Ukrainians culturally have done this. And intriguingly, one of the best books about Pashlost is written by a Ukrainian guy, Nikolai Gogol, who lived in Russia. And this perspective gave him like a clear understanding of just like the vulgarity of how Russian society looked in the 1800s, because he was able to give like a juxtaposition because he's Ukrainian. Yeah, and he was forced to flee the country too. And then he went and lived in Rome. So they even provided another justification. So
yeah, Gogol like to bring it back to your, like one of your thesis about Geist and soul.
Yeah.
That, his view is that at the time, Russia was sort of an
soulless place
of the death of soul.
Yeah. So Gogol's book, I'll be real quick. Gogol's book is called Dead Souls. It's real good. When I talk about ethnocide, I also talk about this word, which I invented, called Geistmord. And Geistmord it's a German construct, but it means the destruction of Geist. And Geist is a German word that can't really be translated into English, but it basically means soul. But in German, it also means intelligence and your mind. So like it has a slightly different meaning than like the English soul. And so in Russian, the book Dead Souls is called that because the document that you would use to buy or sell a serf back in Russia was called the soul. So like the measuring word for counting serfs was called the soul. So like if someone owned like 50 serfs, they'd say that I have 50 souls of serfs. So like the selling or moving of serfs in Russia was literally the selling of souls back and forth. And so the language of the book was talking about like a soulless country where aristocrats lived off of the selling of serfs, and people tried to get wealth by this soulless pursuit. And so it fit perfectly with what I was trying to do. And now it explains the crisis happening right now. Yeah. Because Putin's pursuit is quite soulless.
Yeah. In this affiliation between Trump and Putin, you also write about in your book, what they have in common isn't that they have similar political ideas or anything. It's that they're ethnociders. Yeah. So let me ask the question. So here's a lightning round, Byrd. They're like, 30 seconds each. Okay. Ready? Ooh. All right, here we go. Please elaborate. First one, please elaborate on good intent as whites' perceived escape hatch for otherwise racist behavior. It seems a major impediment to the clarifying conversation American society must have and sustain to break down our ethnocidal underpinnings.
Yeah, real quick, good intent, it's just a cop-out. Like you can't actually know anybody's intent. And so by having a conversation about good intent, it's just feeding into delusions that we believe that people are trying to do good as they do bad things. And that idea is trumping the outcome and elevating the intent, which we don't even know. So we have to have conversations about like good outcomes and practices and philosophies that are based on like the experience and not what we believe somebody wants to have occur, regardless of what the outcome is.
Okay, thank you. The next question goes to this idea of America as a place that's a pot that's melting, or is it a pot that's boiling? Hold on, here's the question. Is assimilation a less toxic form of ethnocide? That is, the push to set aside the culture of immigrants in favor of a majority culture. At least parts of some immigrant societies work as best they can to maintain their identities, even as they aspire to be part of the larger society.
Yeah. So the idea of assimilation isn't inherently bad. It's just that, like, the question is, what are you assimilating into? I think that's the part where people realize that if they have a culture and they try to assimilate into whiteness, at the end of the day, they're not getting another culture. They're getting like the absence of culture and the opportunity to, allegedly, the opportunity to get money in exchange. That's like not a bargain that people actually would want to do if they knew that's what it was. So I think that's like the problem. When it comes to the melting pot, America likes to say it's a melting pot, but like if it's actually a melting pot, there's a word for the outcome. You know, it'd be like if we had fondue and there wasn't a word called fondue in the world. So like if it's melting together, there needs to be a word for what that melting is. We don't have it. So that means we're actually not melting together. Like we try to say that we're melting into white, but white makes it impossible to do that. So if you melt together, what's the word to describe the outcome? We don't have it, therefore we're not melting. So it's just like a bad faith facade.
Yeah, and it also reminds me a little bit of Isabel Wilkerson's thesis about caste systems in the United States, that we're not a melting pot, and we're not. A friend recently told me that another way to think of it is as a salad. And then in the chat, somebody said, "Well, what about goulash?" But really, there are strata. We still live in a caste system in America that's perpetuated by ethnocide. What do you think about that?
Yeah, like you can say the caste system if you want. I think that's fine, but like ethnocide is clearly worse than just like a caste system. You know, that's a word that you can use to like describe how ethnocides tried to work, but like the caste is a byproduct of division, and it's not a salad. Like salads exist like harmoniously together. Like we live in a place that just has like constant tension and conflict, and just try to come up with the language that the terror and conflict is an extension of freedom, that is harmony or peace. You know, like, you know, it's crazy. People are told to send their kids to school with the understanding that somebody may come into that school with a gun, but hey, that person having access to a gun is an extension of freedom. You should be happy sending your kid to a war zone because we've told them how to hide in closets. Welcome to democracy. Like, that's crazy, but that's the salad, you know? Like, who would eat a salad if the lettuce was trying to kill the tomatoes and the dressing was like poison? You know, it's nuts.
Yeah, Kundera's Book of Laughter and Forgetting too. You know, it's hard to melt all that together.
Like, who would eat that? Like, if you looked at something and all the stuff inside it were just like fighting, and they said, "We're delicious, we're fighting, it's delicious." Like, you're not going to eat that. It's nuts.
Well, I'm never going to look at a salad the same way again. So how about this idea of, it's another word that you made up. So you're word make-upping, but all words are made up. And you're trying to, you're inventing new words to help describe and define ethnocide and what it means in society around the globe and also in America. And toward the end of your book, you come across this new word to explain, in essence, and this is my interpretation of it, Byrd. I'm probably way off, but you know, anyone really who isn't an ethnocide or anyone who isn't white, Black Americans, Asian Americans, Latin Americans, and even those are, you know, charged expressions these days. But so you say it's difficult to explain all of that. That a better way to think about it is there are ethnociders and there are ethnocidees, and the ethnocidees, you come up with the word Fricano, and I'm wondering if you could share with our audience how you came up with that and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'll say Fricano. So basically, as a Black person in America, part of the existence of a Black person is trying to liberate yourself from all of the oppressive white ideas that have been forced to define your existence since forever. And that includes the name that the society calls you. Like, there isn't a continent called Black. So like, why are we called that? Like, there isn't a continent called N-word. Why are we called that? Like, it's because white people destroyed the culture and then gave a whole mass of people a dehumanizing identifier and said, this is what we'll call you in the society forever. And so as Black people have gotten more agency in the society, we've tried to liberate ourselves from these dehumanizing identifiers. That's why the N word is no longer socially acceptable. But, if you go back, Negro is also not socially acceptable. But like Negro just got removed from the census like maybe a decade ago, if that. And so there's a journey, a linguistic journey of like emancipating Blackness from being defined by ethnocide. And so that journey, clearly, if you look at, the civil rights movement, there was like, I'm Black and I'm proud. There were, in the 1980s, African American became like a new term that we just created out of thin air. Recently, the conversation about making Black capitalized and not lowercase has been pretty significant. And so I think we're at a point where, strangely, I think we're like seeing that capital B Black is like the end of the conversation. And I just don't think that's adequate, because that's still like an identity that's based on a color and not our cultural experience. So we have to have a name that's indicative of our culture. So I was like, I'll just make up a word. I'll just make it. And my partner, she's Mexican American. And, in California, they have Chicano culture. That's just a word that Mexicans created out of thin air when they left Mexico and lived in America. And it starts from Mexicano, and they got the X and changed it to a CH. And they took off the ME because they were no longer in Mexico. So they're like Mexican people, but not in Mexico. So they were Chicano or Chicano. And I was like, that's a neat idea. So let me see if I can work with that. And this just happened to me, this came to me like in a dream. And I was like, I woke up and wrote notes. I was like, I think I did something here. And so I saw like African, and I said, all right, let's cut off the A. And then that leaves the word Fricon, C-A-N, Fricon. And so, but then that just describes a people who are African who aren't in Africa anymore. But that's clearly not the whole extent of the culture, because we're in an ethnocidal place. And so they're trying to destroy all of our culture. So even though we're African people not in Africa, we're not hanging out with other African people because of our shared language and culture. They're actively breaking up communities and families and putting people together who don't speak the same language because it's easier to oppress and all that kind of stuff. And so the question then becomes, if we're not able to connect to each other via our shared African culture, because ethnocide is actively working to destroy that every single day, every single second of every day, what's the bond? And the bond of Black people is to free ourselves from ethnocide. Like that's been the goal since the beginning. And so I then took the FRI and I made FREE, because now that speaks to like what the shared culture is. That shared culture is freedom. Like authentic freedom, not oppression with the word freedom used in its stead. And so I had the word Fricon, but I'm like, that word is linguistically exclusively English. So I decided to try to be a bit more inclusive and put like an O at the end, but that O could also be an A, it could be an X, it could be an E. Like I'm not spearheading the conversation about like, the gendered words in the Latino community. So whichever ones people want to use at the end, they could do it. But Fricano is like one iteration. That's the primary one as a man. That's what I would say I am, there's no hierarchy. So that's the word Fricano. I just thought this would be a word that Black people could use to describe our culture. Instead of just saying that we're Black, we could say we're Fricano. But I'm not forcing it on people. If people read the book and they like it and this becomes like a thing, then it's a thing and we grow with it. I'm not going to be an oppressor that says you have to call yourself this because I came up with a word one day. Like that's ridiculous.
Well, I think
but one thing that happened is once I came up with this word and I would talk to people who weren't Black, since the word didn't have anything specifically about race, it was more about a cultural narrative. Other people who weren't Black were like, can I also be that? And I was like, maybe, like, I don't know, but you couldn't take it from Black people. That'd be ethnocide. So maybe, the word evolves and there's like Asian Fricano or this Fricano or blah, blah, like, I don't know, but like, it's another like beginning of a conversation. And, white people were like, well, what would white people call themselves? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I'm not a white person. Like, I'm not going to tell you what you need to call yourself. Just like you told us what we should call ourselves. I think there's a problem with that. You figure it out on your own. If you want me to collaborate with you, I'm more than happy to do that, but I'm not going to tell white people what to call themselves. But hopefully we can have like a good faith conversation and not a bad faith one, and get to something that's less ethnocidal regarding white identity. And then clearly, if you don't identify as white because you've come up with like a good faith identifier instead, it makes it easier to not do ethnocidal things because you won't be trying to preserve this essence of whiteness at the expense of the existence of like millions, billions of people.
So Barrett, we'll wrap this conversation, this good faith conversation, and look forward to having additional ones. In your book, you write about how it's easier to break something than to make something. And I think the perspectives that you provide, the ideas provided about etymology and entomology and philosophy and a whole variety of other things that help us see the world in a truer way, has done both. It's both breaking things and making things. So on behalf of the American Bar Association, the Center for Human Rights and its Dignity Rights Initiative, as well as the Dignity Law Institute at Delaware Law School and Dignity Rights International, Byrd, let me thank you and thank everyone for joining us for this conversation. We'll be hosting a couple of other conversations to come about human rights and ethnocide, and about ecocide and ethnocide in the months to come. We hope you'll join us. Byrd, thank you again so much. I really enjoyed the book and enjoyed the conversation. And I think it's a thing and you're onto something. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.